episode of Creative Writing Advice with me, JJ Barnes. If you don't know me, I'm the author of How to Write a Story, which is out now on Amazon. I take you from the beginning of your story all the way through to the end, and I cover everything in between as well. And I'm over here on YouTube doing the same sort of thing. I'm trying to give you confidence and encouragement as well as actual skills to help you get your story out into the world. What I like to do sometimes is talk about not a specific tip or trick, but talk about something to do with writing in general and the world, like conversations that the writing community have over on Twitter, which is where this actually came from. So I had a conversation with an amazing writer over there called Zoe May about whether books should have trigger warnings. Because sometimes you can be surprised by a book. You can go in expecting one thing and find that it takes a turn that you haven't been expected. And this is something that's occurred to me because I started writing YA. I wrote for teens. So my first two books are about a 15-year-old girl. So there's certain content you don't put in YA. You don't write like a graphic sex. If sex happens, you don't go into it because that's inappropriate. Your violence can happen. You know, think of the Hunger Games. There's plenty of violence in it, but you're careful. You're not writing your faces being ripped off. There's a big difference between the Hunger Games and Silence of the Lambs. You know what I mean? So there are certain things that you don't do in YA. Then I moved on and I wrote a book for adults, Emerald Wren and the Coven of Seven. In that, there is much more graphic violence. It's still not, because it's not my style to sort of, I wouldn't write particularly graphic violence, but the Emerald Wren violence is significantly more than the YA book violence in the Prospero books. And I didn't put a trigger warning. I kind of hoped that the description of the age of the characters would be enough of a description to tell people the age appropriateness of the story. Then I wrote a children's book. So definitely, and then I wrote another adult book. Not a violent book, but a more sexual and swearing book. And Zoe talked about how she wrote her thriller under a different name, so that there wouldn't be confusion, because her lovely rom-com books are significantly different. And I chose not to. And it's a question I've asked myself regularly of whether it was the right choice. Because the reason I chose not to, and I did think about it, was it takes a really long time to build up an audience, and it takes a lot of work, and the idea of starting again from scratch, I couldn't cope with it. My audience is too small. If you're someone like J.K. Rowling and you start releasing books as Robert Galbraith, you're going to be okay, because if people are like, oh, that's J.K. Rowling with a different name, we'll go over there, we'll read her work, right? And again, Zoe has a bigger readership than me, so she was able to launch that successfully, and like brilliantly successfully. I'm very small, and the idea, I mean, especially when I first started out, I'm bigger now, but I don't feel confident enough in my own audience size to start from scratch with an entire new name. So I chose not to. Zoe was talking about her thriller book and whether that should have a trigger warning on it because it's quite graphic, it's quite dark. And even if you're going into it knowing it's a thriller, it could jolt you. So I wanted to talk about that. Should books have trigger warnings? And I know it's considered like a snowflakey millennial term, and how we all need to toughen up. But it's a legit question, because there are things that you can see or read that will disturb you. And if you're not if you want to be disturbed, then, you know, that's what you want. But if you are going into it, like, innocent of what you're about to experience, and we do it with films because we put ratings on them. So I wouldn't ever want to say, watch The Human Centipede. Don't want that. I looked at the rating, I looked at the description, and was like, no, that's not for me. But I do like 18s and whatever. If you're American, I think it's R rated, I think. But the point is, I do like violent and scary films, but I have lines that I wouldn't want to cross with my viewing. And we don't really have a rating, an age rating, or a trigger warning, a content warning on books. As I say, you do on films. Like, It tells you contains graphic violence, contains swearing, contains sex, contains drug use. Like, it lists them. And I mean, unless it does on some books, I don't see that on books. And should we? Because it's something we need to think about, because that's a responsibility. When you're putting a story out into the world and you're putting essentially images into people's heads, there's a responsibility to that, and you don't want to take advantage or surprise people. Ultimately, what we settled on was, as long as you're clear in your description and you don't wildly swing out of genre, you're probably going to be okay without it. So, for instance, if you sell your book as a light chick-lit rom-com book and then someone gets hacked to death and their skin taken off, you are going to massively alienate and offend and upset your rom-com chick-lit audience. If you sell a book as a YA book, adventure story like Hunger Games, and then you throw graphic sex into the middle of it and it's all very pornographic suddenly, you are going to alienate your audience. So you do have to be careful to be clear what genre you are writing in, target an age-appropriate and genre-appropriate audience, and make sure that any advertising you do is clear. I wouldn't try and sell my What Ivy Wants book to children, because it's got swearing in it, it's got references to sex in it, it's got a lot of drinking in it. It wouldn't be appropriate. But I could take clips out of it, little snippets that would be completely age appropriate for any age, because no book is all the way through. Well, I suppose some might be all the way through really graphic, but most books have got, you know, rise and fall in all aspects, including sex and violence. So you could snip it and then market it in a way that makes it seem, even if you don't explicitly say it's appropriate for children, you could market it in a way that looks appropriate for children. So you have to be careful, you have to be really clear who it is you're selling this book to, who you wrote it for, what the content is. And as long as you do that, you're going to be okay. You might still alienate people if they aren't expecting something particularly dark, but you can't please everybody. And that's one of the things about writing. You have to kind of develop a bit of a thick skin, because you can offend people no matter what you do. And that's true of life, let's be honest. We're all on Twitter, aren't we? Well, I know not all of us, but you know what I mean. But you have to be careful. So when you're looking at your book, looking at your work, and making your marketing strategies and your advertising and trying to sell, which is something all writers are out there. We're all, if you've got a book out, a lot of your energy goes into trying to convince people to read it. Don't try and convince people to read it by lying to them. Don't think I will hit a wider market if I just miss out some details from my marketing strategy. If I just ignore that, I can reach a wider audience with my advertising, lure them in, and make a book sale. Because if you make a book sale and then alienate that reader because you have shocked them with content that you hadn't sort of implied or told them was in it, they're never going to read another one of your books. And people talk. They are not going to be complimentary about your book, and they'll probably leave you a bad review too. So there's 3 reasons right there. So make sure your strategy for selling your book is targeted and clear. And if you are writing a book with sex, violence, drugs, drinking, anything like that, don't mask it. Make sure that you can tell people the age of your characters, because that will be a big part of it. Like in Nature Girl, she's 7, so immediately you can tell that book isn't aimed at 40-year-olds. Whereas in Ivy, she's 30, so that book isn't aimed at 5-year-olds, because 30-year-olds behave and do things that 5-year-olds cannot, and vice versa. So I don't think we need trigger warnings on books. I don't think it's necessary. But I do think you have to be really upfront clear about what style of book you've written, what your genre is, and make sure that you at least hint towards some of the content. I remember my mom let me rent a book from the library about vampires when I was a teenager, and I was very into Buffy the Vampire Slayer. So my mom was like, yeah, because I found this book about vampires, and she gave it a quick glance over. My gosh, should 15-year-old me not have been allowed to read that book? I'm not going to say the writer, because I don't like to sort of slam on writers. Also, this was, sort of 20 years ago. Gosh, it was 20 years ago. But the point is, the book didn't tell my mother clearly enough that this wasn't a vampire book appropriate, because the girls in it were only 16. So from the face of it, 16-year-old girls, vampires, oh, she loves Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Perfect. Wrong. That book should have been much more clear that that was not appropriate reading for me. So that is where you have your problem. You have to be clear, you have to be transparent, and then I don't think trigger warnings would be necessary. But if you disagree, if your conclusion following this conversation I'm having sort of with you via my video camera is that actually, yes, books should have a more clear, like either an age range, like an age limit sort of badge on them like movies do, or some kind of checkbox sort of as a standard that we include on all covers, I wouldn't disagree with you strongly. This is the conclusion that I came to with this conversation with Zoe. But I am willing to be told that I'm wrong, of course, because it is something to consider, and it can have a really negative effect both for you as the writer and the audience person or people who have been stunned and affected by that. So, what do you think? Should books have trigger warnings? I can see both sides of the argument, but I'm curious because I'd like to know what you think. So thank you very much for watching another one of my videos. I hope this has been interesting and thought-provoking for you. Yeah, come and find me on social media. My website is jjbarnes.co.uk, and you'll find my Facebook and my Twitter and my Instagram there. And I love having these kind of conversations with writers on Twitter, because everybody's loves their craft so much. And as I say, we're all here, all trying to sell our books and trying to make a living, and we all care so much about our stories, and it's really great to connect with people who are in the same situation. So come find me, come chat to me. If you subscribe to this channel, I put out a video every Monday, Wednesday and Friday at 9:30 in the morning. If you put on the little dinky bell thing, it will tell you when my video comes out. Also keep an eye out because other things go out on this channel as well. I do a podcast, and the audio for that goes out so that you can listen. It doesn't have me talking, like it's not a video, but it's the audio from it and other things as well. So keep a lookout. And what else am I supposed to have said? I don't know. I think that's it. So thank you very much. I'll see you next week. Bye.